Good afternoon to our panelists and to our audience today. It's a pleasure to all be here. My name is Tommaso Poncelet. I'm a managing director in Citi's debt capital markets business in the investment bank. I'm responsible for debt issuance in Turkey, as well as a few other EM jurisdictions. It's an honor to have this opportunity to present this discussion as part of TÜYİD's 2020 summit. Last year, I think we had a great day all together in Istanbul, and I think we now realize how fortunate we were to be all in person. This year, circumstances are different, and with luck, hopefully in 2021, we will be together in person again. I'm joined on this panel by three subject matter experts with whom I look forward to debating the rise of ESG financing. Amanda Gray is a principal. She's responsible for EM financial institutional investing for Apollo's fixed income credit business. Meral Murathan is an executive vice president at TSKB, and she's responsible for development, financial institutions relations, investor relations, and loan monitoring departments. And Richard Betts is with us as well from KPMG's Sustainability Services business. He's a director there. So if I may, I'd like to ask our panelists today to introduce themselves. Perhaps we start with Amanda, and then we go to Meral, and then to Richard, and then we'll go into our Q&A session.
As Tommaso has already said, I'm joining from Apollo, and we are a leading alternative investment manager. And the EM team is fairly new within Apollo. I myself joined only a year ago, but I've been investing in emerging markets corporate debt for the last 15 years. And for most of that, I've been focused on the financial sector. I was quite pleased when Tommaso invited me to join because I've invested in Turkish bank bonds through many choppy waters, and it certainly wouldn't have been possible without the integrity and the incredible patience of the Turkish investor relations teams. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Amanda. Meral?
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me for attending this panel too. So I'm working at TSKB for the last 22 years. This is my first experience versus institution. And today, again, it's going to be joyful for me to discuss sustainability journey and the ESG perspective, which is becoming gaining much of a greater importance. So thank you very much for listening to us today.
Thanks, Meral. Richard, over to you.
Thanks, Tommaso, and thanks everyone. So yes, I'm Director in Sustainability Services for KPMG based in Istanbul. I've worked on sustainability for many years. Initially for KPMG in London for a lot of years. Now I've been in Turkey for about 7 years, and I've led sustainability projects for about 25 countries in total across Europe and Asia, and I've had a lot of focus on sustainable financing from the beginning. So pleasure to be here.
Great, thanks, Richard. So as we get to the next section, we're going to go through 8 or 9 questions today. I'm going to perhaps turn to Amanda with a first question to perhaps set the scene. And I'm sort of interested to understand why sustainability and the green agenda is important to investors and ultimately providers of capital, whether that's debt primarily in your case, and or equity more broadly as well.
Sure. I think maybe it's interesting to hear how we got to this place at all. So I would just say that if you ask any emerging market investor, they'll tell you that they've always considered ESG when investing in emerging markets. But maybe 3 or 4 years ago, things started to really change. We started getting calls from pension funds or insurance companies, all of our investors, and they were asking about how we integrated ESG in our investment process, and asking us, could we integrate ESG, and asking us, what did that mean? Because a regulator told them that they needed it, but they didn't really know how to do it. And what ensued was a series of roundtables and teach-ins and conference calls where we finished with more questions than answers. And really, the industry's coalesced around this idea of, okay, we need to integrate ESG by having the same investment teams that are assessing the financial performance of companies and their strategies, assessing their ESG, and then incorporating that into the ultimate investment decisions. So when we price your bonds, we also think about your ESG risk. Quite important. And it happened really quick from there. So from the point of, just discussing what we should be doing and having even some portfolio managers in the industry saying it was a fad, it would blow past and they could ignore it, we went to, walking into investor meetings with our portfolio managers and having the investors quiz us on our portfolio's ESG, having taken our entire portfolio and looked at its ratings in Sustainalytics or MSCI and asking us, why do you hold that bond when they have such a low ESG score, right? It became very serious. And then the pension fund advisors, the sort of gatekeepers of capital in our industry, started assessing us not just on whether or not we incorporated ESG, but how well we were doing it, right? So it's gotten to the point where it's no longer sort of a novelty or an interesting idea. It's an absolute must-have if you hoped to raise assets in this market and to, frankly, retain your investors today.
Thank you, Amanda. That's incredibly interesting. I think perhaps an issuer's perspective on this, and Meral, I would turn to you. It has been said in the past that there is a cost, there's an element of challenge and pain in terms of the decision to have an agenda around ESG. And I think the question to you is, in your capacity, obviously, TSKB is a funding official, but also in TSKB's capacity as an advisor in the Turkish market, what do you think are the biggest decisions, the hardest decisions that corporates, banks, and ultimately a sovereign need to make in setting an ESG agenda and complying with it?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. As Amanda said, nowadays sustainability is becoming a must rather than a preference. And when I say so, I really have a belief in that, because as a very recent example, even ECB has announced that they will be accepting KPI-linked issuances as well. So. Recent developments all over the world show us that institutions eventually have to start their own ESG transformation. And we believe that there is no single right way of doing, managing this journey. Yet institutions on their own could benefit from the globally accepted targets, which is evolving from day one to other through various parties around the same mission. And certainly around to legislations. So as a development and investment bank established 70 years ago, our mission is actually to support the sustainable and inclusive development of our country, Turkey. In this direction, we have been closely collaborating with DFIs since our foundation, and for the last decade, mainly with IFIs as well. And who become really the pioneers in sustainability targets and requirements. This actually enabled us catching up with the recent developments, targeting the agenda, following the agenda in this field, and integrating what we are learning to the new ideas to our business model. So we will continue this path. The bank's targets further to approval of such strategies actually our organizational structure is actually helpful with us pursuing this path. We have a sustainability committee comprising of the attendance of 4 board members, including our CEO, and 2 executive vice presidents. And the importance of this committee is actually advising and issuing the strategies of the bank around the sustainability agenda. And then the work is handled through sustainability working groups. Now we have 8 working groups, including climate risks related assessments. And I must say that 20% of our workforce is attending at these levels. So maybe I could note that the important part in our efforts, we believe that sustainability should be embraced by top to bottom in a company and integrated into the business model through all decision-making processes, through each layer, I guess. And it has a potential not corresponding the efforts with the target unless it's managed by if it is managed by a single department in the organization or single group of people. So it should be embraced by the whole population of the institution itself. I already talked about our organizational structure, so that's quite helpful around this. And we could also note that each stakeholder, including investors nowadays, would like to have an understanding of the long-term perspective of that institution, as Amanda was referring to. So its targets and KPIs, how it assesses those targets and how it reports in line with its strategy. And within the scope of financial and non-financial data, it's actually quite challenging to identify and determine those short-term to medium to long-term targets each and every year, while you are accounting for the previous year's results, outcomes. Even if you are in an environment of volatile and quickly changing environments with changing again dynamics with several risks and opportunities, it's a bit more of a challenge, actually, I must say. And another point maybe I should note is the reporting principles. Again, the identification of the data, collection, measurement, and tracking of that. In this regard, investors are also requesting various data, as Amanda was mentioning, in order to efficiently monitor the development journey of the institution they have invested in. So they must actually confirm that their decision making was correct, and they have to account for their own decision making too. So that's just like a circle, feeding each member of that circle to the other point at the very same centered topic, maybe. And also the legislation is important. Legislative forces, the effect of legislation is also important. Here we must say that the value of the CMB, maybe Richard will be mentioning of that, they have requested the announcement of their own sustainability journey with the correct data in their financial disclosures. So it's gonna lead many Turkish companies, if they haven't yet started with this journey, to continue and develop their own practices. Thank you.
Thank you, Meral. That's very interesting and helpful and insightful. Richard, perhaps sort of turning to you from an advisory perspective, I think it'd be interesting to understand how ultimately all of this agenda is impacting corporate strategy and decision making. Thinking in particular about sort of, obviously part of it is investing, but the other part is divesting. And so, you know, how should people think about portfolios of their businesses going forward, and what different approaches are you seeing to managing transition risk?
So thanks for that. And well, I think firstly important to sort of comment that you know, divestment from fossil fuels, as an example, you know, this is already a very significant global trend. Something that started, you know, quite recently, 10 years ago, from you know, a grassroots movement in the States. It's now branched out and it's become a global movement, and this is something that's sort of gaining a lot of momentum. But you know, there are well over 1,000 institutions globally that have begun or committed to divestment from fossil fuels in this case, and for assets totaling, again, it's changing rapidly, but over $12 trillion of fossil fuel investment. So this is something that's become very significant in the last years, and I guess significant not just in terms of sort of the direct impact of the divestment, but more in terms of the challenge that this represents to the social license to operate for certain, for a certain sector, certain businesses, and the uncertainty that this represents for the future cash flows that I think is significant. And then there have been sort of very well documented cases recently of all companies that have had to write down by billions of dollars the value of their assets, partly over concerns over the future price of oil, coupled with shale gas bankruptcies in the US, Exxon being removed from the DJ index for the first time in a century. Many countries now have phase-out plans for coal in just the next few years. And then on the other side, how a lot of the largest companies by market cap are now from other sectors, big tech companies, renewable energy companies, companies that have now, in some cases, companies that have reinvented themselves as broader energy companies, such as Ørsted, that, we can see, yes, how the top companies by market cap are from other sectors, big tech, renewable energy companies. And so I think when you look at this the overall picture, well, clearly this has moved on to a next phase. Maybe at the beginning it was sort of being primarily driven by sort of ethical investors. Now it's become a lot more mainstream. And so I think in terms of investment strategies, clearly they're evolving. This whole area is rapidly evolving. So I think increasingly we'll see investors moving investments to sectors that offer bigger returns, more stable long-term returns in light of this uncertainty over sort of this huge uncertainty that we see. So I think that's important to know. So I think in this area we'll see expansion. We're already seeing expansion. We'll also see diversification. A lot of ESG data, as Miral said, it's no longer a nice to have. It's increasingly a must have. In recognition that this is business, this is business critical. But still, we'll see a lot of diversification, because I think there's the realization that ESG is a very broad area, and I think there's the realization that certain areas such as climate change are now business critical. But then more recently, we're seeing a lot of momentum around other areas. So over the last year, there's been some very influential studies around natural capital, for example, and how biodiversity loss is a global crisis, a key threat to the global economy, indeed to all of us. So that's what I mean, that we'll see this is a rapidly evolving area. We can expect to see a lot more diversification. Yes, companies are investors are increasingly focusing on climate change. This will continue. I think we'll see more and more investors looking at their risk exposure in terms of, let's say, carbon exposure for their different investments, and looking to reduce that over time. But they're also going to have to pay attention to some very important areas such as natural capital. So we'll see diversification, and obviously this year, for many reasons, that's pragmatic. But we have to remember that we live in a globalized economy, in a highly interconnected planetary system, and so there are huge interconnections between these issues. So climate change often gets considered as one part of an E, when actually what we're talking about in terms of climate, in terms of some other sustainability issues such as around natural capital, these are the overarching issues of relevance to all businesses and all sectors everywhere.
Thank you, Richard. I'd like to turn to perhaps something more on the detail in terms of how we think about data and collecting data and the quality of data that is ultimately provided. Perhaps we turn to Amanda. This is important in an IR society conference, of course. And the question is, what do you think issuers need to do to be noticed by investors? I mean, it's all very well, we've talked about a lot of the general points, but what is noticed and what does get noticed, and what do investors need to know?
Sure. Okay, so there's all the low-hanging fruit, which I think we've already discussed, the sort of must-haves, and that would be a dedicated member of staff to answer ESG questions, an ESG policy, annual ESG reporting that's following some sort of international norm like SASB, TCFD, or GRI. And then there are things you can do that will garner people's attention. So I quite like this story, this TSKB story about how everyone at every level is working toward their ESG policies and is on board. Something that demonstrates that ESG is a part of the overall culture of your company rather than just a slide in your presentation. So when you talk about your 3-year strategy, set KPIs that are also ESG related, right? Let it not all be financial related. And also we quite like a need help in drilling down to what's most material to your business, right? So within the ESG risks and opportunities, what are like the 2 or 3 things that are really could really impact your financial performance, your reputation, the way that the market views you and trusts you, my bonds, and tell us about how you're addressing those risks. And if you think you can do better, it would be amazing if you could set some sort of quantifiable goal and then track it over time and show us in your presentations regularly, like this is how we're doing. And that would really, really, really impress people. And I guess it goes without saying, governance. When people do ESG scoring, they usually assign a weight to each the E, S, and G, although, they are, it's true, Richard, all interconnected. And governance always plays a really huge role. So make sure if you have great governance, you just sing about it because everyone's concerned with governance today. And finally, and this is a bit selfish, be very patient with us because as I've already described, it was a bit chaotic, how we got to this point, and it's still a bit chaotic. So if we call with questions and we're going in the wrong direction, redirect us, ask us why we're asking. We won't be offended. And please be patient.
Yes, it's good points, and we feel the same way in the sell side community. Sometimes there's a lot to learn, and the landscape is evolving continuously, so it's sometimes difficult to keep up. Meral, perhaps turning to you just to sort of continue the investor and issuer dialogue that we had earlier. Just you alluded to it earlier on. If you like, the burden and the challenge of data collection, reporting, what changes, once you have bought into an ESG philosophy, how does it impact your business? What do you need to do to ensure data collection is good quality, but also not excessively sort of painful to the organization? What are good best practices that can be efficient from your perspective?
I think we are all on the very same page. We are gathering around the same thing. So specifically to your question, Tommaso, the systematical and integrated thinking is, I guess, the key to this question, to this practice actually. Targeting to be a sustainable company actually at the back of itself involves being as much compliant as possible with the ESG parameters from our point of view, and this is a must, as we've been saying. And I guess in this context, I mean, the benefit of following this path is much higher. Even the benefits are in the longer duration. I mean, no matter how and what is much higher than the cost of not sticking to the principles, to those principles. As TSKB, we have a long story of publishing ESG reports. We've started with sustainability reporting long time ago, a decade ago. And after 5 sustainability reportings, we have continued with integrated reporting of ours. And it was the first FI integrated reporting. It's been 4 years now. And 2 years ago, we have started to transform it again, a transformation to integrated annual reporting. And also, as the first, thanks to your advices and contributions, of course, the first green bond issuer in Turkey and the Tier 2 debt issuer, sustainable Tier 2 debt issuer 3 to 4 years ago, we are each year extending our reporting and disclosures on the use of proceeds of those debts, and these are all audited as well. The allocation and impact reporting I'm referring to. So from our point of view, we consider transparency here as a core parameter in the stakeholder engagement, as Amanda was reiterating. And in this perspective, with its, I suppose, rich and focused, concentrated context and easy to follow, to read flow, the integrated reporting, complying with international standards, and being approved with auditors, I guess will serve as a key reference point for all the stakeholders. And we try to improve our IR, I would say, integrated reporting each year after its release, taking into account the stakeholder feedbacks like yourselves and new disclosure requirements, which are increasing a lot. And as well as surely developing global agenda and changing and developing global agenda and the standards. And we try to improve ourselves, the reporting in that context too. For instance, we will be using concrete results of our SDG mapping work, the project out of our loan book. And we will try to address, for example, the COVID-19 effects through each capital pillar that we are using, integrated with financial and non-financial data, maybe the hardest part, at the back of our business lines. And accordingly, we will push harder ourselves for renewed targets and KPIs. Last but not least, I would like to also mention our efforts in integrating the climate risks in our loan portfolio, the assessment and measurement of the climate risks, and integrating those evaluations, let me put it that way, in our loan evaluation criteria, in our procedures in a concrete and detailed way. We have been closely analyzing TCFD studies, and we've been publishing CDP reporting for the last decade. Maybe I should just conclude by saying that those works would actually require a certain willingness and complete belief, I guess, for the strategy, that it is really a necessity of adopting those sustainability principles.
Thank you, Meral. And I'm glad you mentioned the debut green bond experience and sustainable Tier 2 experience from a few years ago. These were fantastic transactions. And also, I think we should celebrate just a couple of days ago, Vakif Bank's
congratulations to them.
Yes, sustainable financing, which I think is an important step for the commercial banking sector, hopefully one that will be followed. So, Richard, perhaps moving to you again on this theme of sort of data collection, establishing standards, and ultimately sort of ensuring that there is a standardization of quality in the analysis and the third-party analysis, and a continuation of that credibility that can be established in the form of third-party providers, establishing themselves as the go-to folks that ultimately are analyzing and thinking around a lot of this. So perhaps some thoughts on that front as a representatives of this broad category.
Yeah, sure. So that's a good point. I think first of all, important to acknowledge the progress that's already been made, because sustainability, general and sustainable financing, they're rapidly evolving areas, and as you touched on, so in terms of sustainable financing, just in the last few years, we've seen first green bonds in Turkey, and indeed globally, the first sustainable bonds were issued only just over 10 years ago in 2007. So this is still quite a new area, a rapidly evolving area. The first issuance globally, 2007. Just 2 years after that, we had the first version of the first step towards standardization. At the beginning, we had IFIs and you can say self-declaring some products, and then just within 2 years, there was sort of the first step towards standardization. We had the first version of the green bond principles that were issued in 2009. And then sort of in the first few years after that, we had the first version of the first sort of international standard, climate bond standard, that was issued. And then since then, we've had revised, updated versions of the green bond principles and also the climate bond standard. And then there's also been green loan principles and frameworks for green sukuk and in other areas. So, I think a great deal has happened in quite a short space of time. So I think it's important to note, we already see, a trend towards standardization and convergence. So that's great. But clearly, it is a journey. It is a work in progress, I think, as with all areas of sustainability. But nevertheless, we see this trend towards more standardization, more convergence. So great, lots been achieved. Looking ahead as to what more can and should be done. Well, I think at the moment, there are a lot of different options out there, and I think this can sort of create some confusion with these different options. And so if we carry on with the example of green bonds, some issuers will self-declare, some will follow, most will follow globally the green bond principles. Some will also follow the international climate bond standard. And then some will obtain, indeed most obtain, a form of external review. According to the latest analysis, well over 90% of recent issuances obtained a form of external review. Many obtain a second party review. Quite a lot also obtain an external verification. So, there are a lot of different sort of options out there at the moment. And then I said, there are a lot of green bonds or the transactions will have a external verification. Many will be at limited assurance level. Some will be at a higher reasonable assurance level, which is the level that's used in the financial reporting world. And I think this links to the point that, thus far, I think, in nearly all cases, what we've seen, has been mainly sort of, these have been initiatives driven by the companies, by the issuers, and hence, we're seeing some different approaches. And, yes, there are standards and guidelines out there that can help companies, issuers as to what they'd align with, but they're not mandatory. And so I think this is, if we want to move to more standardization, then I think clearly there's scope for the role of regulators to standardize this area. Because if not, some companies will say, well, we'll self-declare. Some will say we'll follow the green bond principles. Some will say we'll follow the climate bond standard, and obviously they'll be driven by their priorities, and then also what they think their potential customers.
So Miral, just again changing track a little bit, we wanted to touch on how ESG and transition is impacting your funding strategy. Just thinking about TSKB as an issuer, and what do you think? What sort of financing products have worked particularly well for you, and do you think there's anything missing in the market for ESG finance?
Actually, this growing interest that we've been discussing so far is leading also us to develop new and innovative products. I mean, not us, the market itself is raising that. Up until last year, maybe it was just use of proceeds bonds or loans. But for the last, let's say, 1.5 years, we've been seeing KPI-linked bonds, loans, SDG-linked bonds, loans. So we have several choices around. What is important is I guess, again, I would reiterate it, the willingness and the real trust that institution will follow that path. I don't know. So at least that's our intention, and we will continue to pursue this path. And we are very much keen on actually working on different products and following this agenda, accelerating our stakeholder engagement as well. And so as to shift our learning curve. That's really a journey. There's no stop or ending point, and increase our capacity. In doing so, this year we recently renewed our sustainability bond framework, which will be also letting us using KPI-linked or let me put it like KPI-linked loan instruments as well. It's a very general one, and we've expanded the scope of the investments that could be supported under this framework. So we are a bit excited with this. And at the beginning of this year, we've started with our planning with a KPI-linked loan or bond instrument. Very recently, we have executed it in the form of a loan, and the underlying figure is our ESG scoring, and our commitment is to improve already existing ESG scoring. And this year we renewed this one by the verification of Sustainalytics. Today it's the first ranking score in Turkey, and sixth ranking one among 400 companies globally chosen. So we have a huge target to achieve. Hopefully we will be successful on that. So we will continue to pursue this path in sustainability and all the pillars that it requires. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Miral. And maybe Amanda, then over to you. Just a question in terms of how, what space do you see for innovation in ESG from your standpoint? And perhaps I'll ask a sort of a real kind of bond question. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion around use of proceeds bonds, obviously traditional green or sustainable financings versus KPI linked, and the relative liquidity of the two instruments, the relative value of the two instruments, how investors might appreciate the two potential asset classes, or three potential asset classes. So interested in your thoughts on that.
Sure. I guess I'll start with the bonds, since that's my favorites. I think it really depends on who you are and what sort of money you're managing, your preference. So I think for those of us who we're not, but for those who are running a dedicated green bond fund, or a fund where you've attested to the investors that their money will only go to green projects, it's very important that you stick with the use of proceeds bonds. I understand that. we're managing just conventional bond funds, and we were quite taken with the recent sustainability-linked bond out of Latin America, the Suzano bond. One thing that I thought was most interesting, it was the first ESG bond I've seen in our space to price inside of its secondary curve, specifically because of the structure, and it really got a lot of buzz in the market. People were really excited about it. It's something that I think debt investors can understand really quickly, right? We love covenants. We understand penalty interest.
Yeah.
And so we were quite excited with the idea that like the company and the investors' interests were aligned. We really liked it. As far as innovation goes, of course, there's so much room for innovation. Every week there's a new bond that comes out, a new color. It seems like they always have a color from another region. There's so much that's yet to be done and that we have yet to learn about. So I think it's quite an exciting space. I think from asset management perspective, there are a lot of opportunities for raising different types of funds, impact funds, green funds. So I think across the board, there's a lot of opportunity here.
Thanks, Amanda. It's very, very interesting. Richard, I think we've got perhaps a couple of minutes left, but I'm interested to hear, I mean, from your standpoint, just what can a non-traditionally green issuer do, or traditionally sustainable issuer perhaps do to help and to sort of embark on that journey towards transition?
Yeah, sure. So I'm conscious of time. So I think maybe two quick comments then. One is, sustainable financing is developed at the project level and not at the company level, and hence I think as a first point, there can be companies that may not be considered as sustainability leaders at the moment, but they may be able to gain access to, say, a green bond if they can, develop a project, around energy efficiency or renewable energy, for example. So, the products are at the project level and not at the company level. Secondly, I mean, there are different schools in this area, but there is a lot of discussion around potential sort of bridging solutions. So, when we look at what's available now, we can say that, yes, there are renewable energy technologies that are evolving rapidly, sustainability technologies. There are a lot more that are sort of in a very, initial phase, but not sort of widely available at the moment. So clearly one point can be around, as a short-term bridging solution. Certainly some will argue that, we can transition from, say, coal to natural gas. We can sort of use carbon capture storage in the short term. And so there may be sort of financing solutions around sort of transition bonds, for example. And I know there has been sort of discussion in this area, including from sort of from AXA, to sort of help finance this potential.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. That's a good positive tone to close out on. And I think we've officially run out of time. So I think I want to say thank you to our panelists today. Thanks, Amanda. Thanks, Meryl, and thanks, Richard. It's been a real pleasure, and you've provided, I think, some great insights. I hope we, have supplied us some food for thought for everybody, and you found the discussion interesting. And I think ultimately we hope we will all have a safe, healthy, and happier, I should say, 2021 as we look forward to next year. So with that, thanks again, and take care, everybody.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, thanks everyone. Okay,
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.